You know, let me back this up with a little bit of history. I don't want to bore you with history.
Our first great compromise was called the Constantinian compromise. That in around 313, we moved from the catacombs to the basilicas. We moved from the lower class to the upper class. We moved to an identification with power and money and war. That's why we were called Roman Catholics, because the Roman Empire pretty much took over the show. And we needed an imperial God who could unify Europe and the Middle East. And you know what? This name, and I emphasize name, this name Jesus fit the bill, even though it had almost nothing to do with his teaching, and in many ways was absolutely contrary to his teaching.
So after 313, when we become the established religion of the Roman Empire, you've probably heard how these very sincere seekers went off to the deserts of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Cappadocia, which is eastern Turkey, and that became the birth of what we now call monasticism. The reason it happened was because the main line of Christianity had become fast food religion. Right? Everybody was just Catholic because the whole kingdom was now Catholic.
It all starts after that great compromise in 313, where we move into the upper class, into imperial thinking, and so huge amounts of Western Christians go off to the deserts of Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Cappadocia, which is eastern Turkey. And there is where Christianity flourished, plus these little outlying places like Ireland and Scotland, which were not a part of the Roman Empire. Knowing by not knowing, or not needing to know, knowing through darkness. I would say after the desert period, what we would call unitive thinking, or non-dual thinking, or the balancing of knowing with not knowing, is only systematically taught in some monasteries. We got to be honest. The whole mystical tradition of knowing through darkness that we see in Dionysius in the early centuries, in the cloud of unknowing in the 14th century, for the last 500 years, once we got into the food fights of the Reformation, and that's what they were, all right? We're right and you're wrong. Our denomination is saved and your denomination is not saved. I'm going to make a strong statement, but I don't think it's much of an overstatement. That was the death of the contemplative mind. Once you need to prove that you're right and someone else is wrong, that you're the in-group and they're the out-group, what you have is the dominance of ego. And once the ego is center stage, there is no possibility of contemplation. It's all about you. It's all self-referential, and thinking declines. And let's be honest, we're seeing it in our present politics. Just could we have imagined that human, civil, public conversation could go this low? But that's all you have left when you have dualistic thinking paramount. In fact, it's the only game in town. As a Franciscan, as a priest, it tells me religion has not been doing its work. We are not transforming this culture.
Nevertheless, there was always a strain that wanted to go deeper and say, what's Jesus really talking about? So they started using another word for prayer, and that word is contemplation. But I know for most people, the very word contemplation, they say, where did that come from? Well, what happened is that our word prayer, that Jesus uses a lot, the Bible uses a lot, had already been cheapened, trivialized 2 centuries into Christianity. And it became a functional, problem-solving, practical thing. To pray meant to make announcements to God and tell God what you needed. It was a transactional thing, all right? So they started using another word for prayer, and that word is contemplation. It's lasted down till our time. So in the Catholic Church, we have contemplative monks who make that their whole life, contemplative orders. It's really a different form of consciousness. It's not saying prayers, it's living in constant unitive union with God and everything around you. So whatever you do is a prayer.
I mean, any of you familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, you can't make that by any stretch of the imagination into an imperial worldview or an exclusionary worldview, or a mental worldview. It's entirely intuitive, love-based, nature-based, community-based, unitive consciousness.
That's why Paul can twice say in his letters, pray always. He can't mean walking around saying the Our Father all day. And the very fact that in Luke's gospel, they have to ask him, teach us a prayer, like the disciples of John the Baptist have. We can assume he hadn't taught him a verbal prayer. His form of prayer when he goes off to the desert is what we would call contemplative prayer, where you rewire this mind so that everything you do is connected in loving union with the moment, with whatever's right in front of you. That's contemplation. Now it takes practice. I'm not there yet. I've been practicing all my life. On my better days, I touch upon it. I can enjoy it for moments. But it's hard to maintain a contemplative mind 24 hours a day because you keep getting pulled into argument, emotion, feelings, hurts, agendas, all the rest. So you have to practice rewiring this. The normal way you and I are wired is dualistically, right? Where you're presented with good or bad, gay or straight, black or white, good or false or true, and male or female, and then you're supposed to choose one of those. That's why America's so angry today. Really, I'm not exaggerating that. When that's the only mind you have, and you have to make a false choice and make men better than women or women better than men, you're never happy because it isn't true. It's never true. It's a false truth. And then you ensconce yourself in it and have to defend it and have to defeat the other side and show why they're terrible. That's the non-contemplative mind.
In the first half of life, success, security, containment, looking good to ourselves and to others are almost the only questions. They are the early stages in what Maslow later called the hierarchy of needs. We all want and we deserve and need various certitudes, constants, and assurance policies at every stage of life. But we have to be careful if we get so used to this container and maintaining our container and building up the walls of our container, they totally take over. And by the second half of life, they become all controlling needs. These are the rigid people we all know, who aren't, to be very honest, very easy to live with. It's either my way or the highway. There's only one way to do it. They would tend to be cognitively rigid, and now we have even evidence that when you have the same response over and over again, now I'm told this by brain scientists, when you use a certain neural groove, it myelinates, it strengthens, and the ones you don't use die away. So I guess I can say this at 68, at my age, a lot of us are sort of boring people because we just give the same three responses, right? There's not a freshness, there's not an originality, there's not a hearing this unique person, this unique situation. We just fit it into our three remaining neural grooves, and we react to it in the way we react to everything. It's not supposed to be that way. If you do life right, the whole thing opens up, and you find out there's about 3,500 neural grooves in between each of them that you usually use. Maybe we'd call that subtlety. Maybe we'd call that compassion. Maybe we'd call that patience. Maybe we'd just call it wisdom. And that's what you expect from an elder, a little more studied response. I hope you have been in the presence of at least one true elder in your life. They usually don't speak first. I know among our native peoples in New Mexico, I started with the Acoma Pueblo as a deacon in 1969. And the old men and the old women would just sit as we'd talk on, and everybody at middle age would take sides and yell at one another. And they just listen and listen and listen, and then stand up and with calm authority somehow summarize the best and the truth from both sides. You see, dualistic thinking makes you think that bipartisanship, Republicans yelling at Democrats and defeating the other side, is going to get you to wisdom. It doesn't. It's not even close, right? Wisdom is transpartisan thinking, where you go to a higher level beyond that either or, all or nothing thinking.
Now, it's really only been the last 50 years. It was Thomas Merton, the monk in Kentucky, not far from you guys, who pulled back the veil and said Christianity doesn't teach contemplation anymore. After the Reformation, and we started fighting one another, and then the various Protestant denominations started fighting one another, you can't be contemplative anymore. That was the death of contemplation, because that's the triumph of dualistic thinking. Once you're fighting, you're dualistic. Trust me on that, all right? You've got to choose sides. You've got to prove your opinion. Every debate society can't seek high truth. It settles for a low-level truth between these two debaters. And that's all we have left.
And the Judeo-Christian tradition is still supposed to be the foundational religion of Western civilization, whether it really is or whether it ever was, I don't know. I'm not here to make that point. But, you know, a civilization cannot survive if it is actively involved in hatred toward its own spirituality. And that's pretty much where we're at now, but for understandable reasons. That it just wasn't doing the job. It was more what spiral dynamics would call tribal thinking, blue level consciousness, where it wasn't about being a transformed person, it was about belonging to a tribe. And we were the Catholic tribe, some of you were the Protestant tribe, some of you were the Jewish tribe. And that became the be-all and the end-all, affirming the boundaries of your tribe, why it was right, which left us at a pretty low level of knowing.
So that's why we teach here the contemplative mind. And then we send people back, hopefully, as much more effective change agents. And they're going to be much longer lasting, because now I don't need to win. I don't need to have people agree with me. My truth is held within me, and I offer it if people want it, but if they don't.
Once you need to prove that you're right and someone else is wrong, that you're the in-group and they're the out-group, what you have is the dominance of ego. And once the ego is center stage, there is no possibility of contemplation. It's all about you. It's all self-referential, and thinking declines. And let's be honest, we're seeing it in our present politics. Just could we have imagined that human, civil, public conversation could go this low? But that's all you have left when you have dualistic thinking paramount. In fact, it's the only game in town. As a Franciscan, as a priest, it tells me religion has not been doing its work. We are not transforming this culture.
Nevertheless, there was always a strain that wanted to go deeper and say, what's Jesus really talking about? So they started using another word for prayer, and that word is contemplation.
You see, dualistic thinking makes you think that bipartisanship, Republicans yelling at Democrats and defeating the other side, is going to get you to wisdom. It doesn't. It's not even close, right? Wisdom is transpartisan thinking, where you go to a higher level beyond that either or, all or nothing thinking. The law of two is inherently antagonistic, argumentative, either or. This is what I call in my books dualistic thinking. It's what all religions at the mystical levels overcome, because dualistic thinking, I say this as strongly as I cannot get you there, all right? In fact, it will stymie you early on. Here it is in a word. And I even checked this out with Dr. Oz, if you want to be impressed. Got to stay at his house for a few days, and we talked later in the night, and this was years ago, and before he got into diets. But we were talking about theological things, and he's a Swedenborgian, has a very real faith himself. But I said, is it true, doctor, that the mind is a binary system? He said, absolutely. It understands things originally when a little 3-year-old, 4-year-old here's a new word, short, tall. The only way I can understand short is in contradistinction to tall. And many people never go beyond that. They create everything in terms of two, black, white, gay, straight, Catholic, Protestant, male, female, Republican, Democrat. It goes on and on. And then, here's how stupid it gets. You think because you identify with one side, you're smart. We've just gone through 15 months of this, yeah. A country filled with universities and churches and educated people, and most, apart from a bush burning in your life, like the bush that burned before Moses, everybody stays at that early infantile level of thinking. It's called dualistic thinking. The Eastern religions, we got to be honest here, were much better. Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, at understanding that mystical thinking is not the law of two, but as Cynthia says, the law of three. Hegel, of course, Gurdjieff, they both say the same thing. That once you get into three, you get into thesis, antithesis, synthesis, flow, change, movement. God is this energetic, dynamic movement that keeps people greening. Why green? If any of you are students of Hildegard of Bingen, the wonderful German mystic, doctor of the church now, she said it already in the 10th and 11th century. She called it the viriditas, like the Spanish word verde. The greenness, God greens things. I remember when I studied biology in high school and learned about photosynthesis, that everything green in the universe has a certain power to take energy from the sun and transmute it into energy. Isn't that's about as good a metaphor for grace as I can think of, The implanted growing of things from the inside out.